Welcome to Viewpoints. I'm Chris Graham.
And I'm Crystal Graham.
And we're back. Last week we had a repeat. Good reasons, a couple good reasons. One good reason was that Crystal and I were coming back from New York when we normally tape our show, because I got a little trinket here to show. I ran the New York City Marathon a couple weeks ago, as it turns out now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you should tell us a little bit about that experience.
Well, I finished. I didn't run quite the race I wanted to in terms of time, but a couple of nagging injuries. Runners out there watching the show know that you're always dealing with injuries, so that's just part of the course. Finished the race, 26.2 miles through New York, all 5 boroughs, and I got to see New York in a way that a lot of folks don't ever get to.
Well, and I imagine, because you did actually go through the 5 boroughs, that you saw parts of New York that you've never even,
never even imagined. Yeah,
exactly.
We start in Staten Island. We go through Brooklyn for quite a while, probably 12 or 13 miles. You're in Manhattan for a couple different bits. Harlem, you're in the Bronx. You go through Queens, so you go through the whole gamut there. And you see the city in its full splendor, if you want to say, because the streets are lined with thousands upon thousands of people. They're all cheering. There's signs. There's streamers. People handing you food when you're running by. And you, of course, were there too. And the New York City Marathon provides this really neat app, and you could watch me literally running the race. You knew where I was pretty much at any time.
Well, and I was able to join the crowd of observers. There's a mile marker 16, which apparently is like where most people go to catch runners for the first time. And I mean, I was there with literally thousands of other people, but because of the app, I was kind of able to track right when you were on this particular bridge and rounding the corner. And so we were able to see you there and catch you one other time on the course as well.
Yeah, amazing thing to me is there's all these tens of thousands of people lining the course, and I saw Crystal twice. She didn't just see me in waves, because, of course, we're running in waves. I mean, I ran in a group of probably 500 people that I stayed with pretty much the whole time. And I get to mile 16 and I say, hey, there's my wife on the streets of New York. And then mile 25, she was there again. So a very neat experience. I want to do it again, no question about it. So it was fun. And you walked around New York, too. After they gave you the medal, we weren't walking around very well, those of us who had run the race. But when you walked around with the medal on, strangers come up to you for Sunday night and then Monday and say congratulations. People really, the city of New York really embraces that whole event.
It was, and then of course we come home. We took the train home on Monday, and Tuesday is election day.
Yeah, so you talk about a marathon. Run 26 miles on Sunday, and then you're up until 3 in the morning Tuesday night. And we're going to break things down from election day. We have with us our guest, Bob Stuart from the News Virginian, good friend of ours. Bob, welcome.
Well, thank you.
And we're going to start, there's so much to break down on Election Day. Let's start local. Our last tape show here a couple weeks ago, we had Marshall Patty and Carolyn Bragg from the Board of Supervisors of Augusta County talking about the Augusta County Courthouse issue, which the voters overwhelmingly rejected the courthouse move that had been proposed by the Board of Supervisors. First question, were you surprised? You've been covering this issue for years. Were you surprised at that vote?
I was surprised, but the anti-groups, the Common Sense Courthouse Solutions and the Augusta Citizens Coalition invested an awful lot of time and energy, a website. They brought in McGuire Woods. They got lots of contributions, and they just worked really hard to get their message out. And the county took on quite a bit of criticism for allegedly not being neutral. And I thought that their presentations were pretty fact-based, but they were not supposed to take a side on this. Obviously, 6 of the 7 wanted this to happen. And I just think that the people, the sentiment, and I think they tapped into a concern that this could happen to, what could happen to Stanton if there was no courthouse. It could hurt the vibrance of the city and take away a lot of things. And if you look at it strictly from the vantage point of government services, it makes sense to go to Verona. But from the standpoint of what it would do to Stanton to lose the courthouse, it could hurt the city a lot. You might lose lawyers. You certainly lose meals tax. Now the question really becomes, what do you do about renovation and parking and demolishing buildings and all of the things that go with building in Stanton or renovating in Stanton, which it becomes more complicated. You bring the city of Stanton back into the conversation. Can they really afford to do anything since they're renovating or building Lee High School. So,
Well, and I want to apologize first because I do have a cold and I'm coughing here a little bit. But one of the things I wondered too is that, as much effort as made was to educate the residents, it seemed to me that when you go to the polls, if you didn't know anything about the issue and the way that the question was
Yes.
worded, the $45 million price tag was right there. And I wonder if that might have, had an influence on the vote.
well, I think folks just look at the, just look at the $45 million and say, gosh, we could use that money to build more schools. We could use that money for roads. We could use that money for other things. Do we really need a new court services building in Verona? And the reality is, if you do all these things in Stanton, you probably are talking more money than even $45 million. I mean, it could be upwards of $50 million. The $59 million figure that they used to put the same footprint that was going to be in Verona and Stanton, that's been disputed, and I suspect that figure's not really accurate. It would be hard to justify it being exactly correct. It's just a conceptual plan at this point anyway. So
I wrote a column the day of the election too, and I kind of shared some thoughts, trying to prognosticate it best I could. And we in the news business and also the folks on the Board of Supervisors in the politics business, we follow these issues closely, day by day, hour by hour, seeing where things are going to go. My supposition was that the average voter out there, I mean, you saw some signs on, on roads and that kind of thing. You maybe saw an article in the newspaper.
Right.
But for the most part, folks who went out to vote were voting for Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton.
That's true.
Bob Goodlatte, maybe, they were maybe motivated to vote there. And then, oh, by the way, there's this issue on the
Right.
courthouse. And so I predicted that, it maybe would go along in line with the presidential vote. It trailed a little bit behind, I think maybe 4 or 5 points behind Donald Trump's vote total in Augusta County. I think he got 74% in the referendum.
2 to 1.
It was about 2 to 1, yeah.
Yeah.
So could that have been a factor too? Maybe would this have passed perhaps if the board had waited into, say, 2017, 2018 and done it at a different time?
Well, you certainly would have had a lower turnout. And, if you waited another year or so, it's possible you might have had a chance to educate folks more and more about it. The reality is that my sister and brother-in-law live in Fishersville, New Hope, and they're pretty smart people. And my brother-in-law told me he really didn't understand. And when we talked about it, he says, well, it probably makes sense to move to Verona. He voted against it, I believe. But he said it probably makes sense to move it to Verona. If you look at it just strictly from a practical standpoint, it probably does. But then you have all these other questions. What happens to Stanton? It becomes an issue of the region, maybe, as opposed to just one county or one city. It's a regional question. If you take away the vibrance of Stanton, it hurts the region. We're a region. We're not necessarily, like you hear with economic development, it's for the region. It's not necessarily just for one community. So I think that's, what the question in a lot of people's minds. They love Stanton, and they want it to be as great as it can be. And with a courthouse, it stays that way, I guess.
When we had Carolyn Bragg on the show, she was pretty insistent, I think, and of course she was for the move of the courthouse. She was pretty insistent that she believes that the court will intervene and in some way that a judge will force them to make the move regardless of what the citizens voted. And I'm curious if you've had an opportunity to talk to the supervisors since the vote and if you still feel like that's the direction they feel this is going to go.
Well, one of the people I talked to is Tracy Piles, and he seems to think that since the people have spoken that they have a duty to try and make it work in Stanton. He seemed, we'll have to come up with the best plan we can in Stanton. He was very much in favor of going to Verona, but he said, no, the voters, the will of the people has been reflected by this vote, and he feels like they need to try and make it work in Stanton. Now, one of the issues that even after the vote Ms. Bragg was talking about was, what are the legalities of building, if you're a county, of building a new facility in a city? I never even thought about that, but they apparently have asked the Attorney General to even rule on that. Can they buy property? Obviously, the courthouse was, I guess, grandfathered in because it's always been there. It's the county seat. But for them to demolish a building and a parking lot and all that and put up another building, can they do that? There's other questions that, now, you could also say, can they consolidate? Well, if you consolidate, you lose constitutional officers for one of the localities. A combination of, combining courts where you would just use the facilities together seems to make more sense than a consolidation. I don't think you'd get a consolidation because you'd have somebody in Stanton would no longer be Commonwealth's attorney. You no longer have a clerk of court, and they're not going to want to do that, I don't think.
What is your sense of the timing now? Because I'm sure the 6-1 majority on the Board of Supervisors thought things were going to go a certain way, obviously. And maybe now they have to go back to their drawing board. What is your sense of what the next step is?
I thought the Common Sense Courthouse Solutions president, Dwayne Barron, had a good idea, which is to get a committee together, and I think that might be one of the things that's recommended, get a committee together of, not just government folks, but, some folks from both of the communities, and sit down and really, the clerks, the Commonwealth's attorneys, and really put your head together and try to come up with a solution that just makes sense. It's just not, anything terribly drastic, but something that you can work where you could have that committee maybe come back with some sort of a recommendation. And obviously, previously, when the two governments tried to work together, it really didn't work out. But maybe now there's a sense, well, we have to do this, we have to make this work, and we have to find a middle ground. Maybe there needs to be a mediator of sorts in there somewhere, and a third party who could lead them. But I think I thought Dwayne Barron's idea was probably a pretty good idea. Come up with a committee, bring the two communities together. Again, the question with Stanton is if they're going to do what they're going to do at R.E. Lee, will they really have the money that they were talking about previously, the $12.5 million, to do something like it? They were talking about consolidation. I think that's what they were talking about. And this is, again, if I'm the Commissioner of the Revenue or Commonwealth's attorney in Stanton or clerk of the court, I'm not sure I want a consolidation. I'll lose my job. That becomes an issue. So it's complicated.
Yeah.
And it's been complicated all along, and it's less complicated because the referendum's been shot down. You can't come back and do that for 10 years. But
the word complicated, let's use that as a jumping off point now. So complicated, lots of folks in the media and politics, I think even people, we're hearing leaks from the Trump team, thought that the election was going to go a certain way, the presidential election was going to go a certain way. And I don't think even the Trump folks thought it was going to go Trump's way. We hear about the transition efforts that are really getting going kind of late in the game here because they put all their eggs into the basket of just trying to win the election. So Virginia. Now, Virginia did go largely the way that it was expected. In the final accounting, now, those who were watching election night, you saw Donald Trump in the lead on the scoreboard for a long time in Virginia on election night. As it turns out, when the numbers came in fully from Northern Virginia, Hillary Clinton actually won Virginia by a slightly larger margin than Barack Obama won in 2012. That all said, she still was, I think, a 5-point victory, still behind from where she was in the polls at least. Some polls had her winning by 10 points in Virginia. So, how do we make sense of all this?
Well, when you say Virginia is going blue or has become more blue, I think that's true, obviously, in Northern Virginia, and I grew up in Richmond, suburban Richmond. She won by 21 points in Henrico, is at least what I haven't gone and looked directly at the numbers I was told. She won by 36 points in Fairfax. That's 20 points more than what the president won by 4 years ago. So if you go to those areas that have trended blue or are blue, she did pretty well. She didn't do as well in the other places. Now, if you sort of take that to the national level, she did really well in California and New York. She didn't do nearly so well in the rest. And she did, I heard something the other day where she won the 100 largest counties, and you can put Fairfax in there, by 12.5 million. Well, the rest of the counties in the country, she didn't do so well.
That's right.
So I heard a lot of analysis. I talked to JMU, I talked to UVA Center for Politics. What I came away from that with was that in those states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, not enough union votes, not enough millennial votes, not enough African American votes. Maybe you could say the Obama magic or appeal, maybe the Obama ground game. And union people just, weren't that enthusiastic apparently in the end. And millennial, we had heard from the get-go it was more Bernie Sanders than her. Ultimately, maybe the base just didn't turn out the way the polls projected they would. And I think that's true a lot of places. And I don't know, if I was to go back and do a revisit, I'd say, boy, I wouldn't have spent that much time in North Carolina. I would have gone to Wisconsin. I would have gone to Michigan. I would have gone to Pennsylvania. I would have maybe Florida, but I mean, those other states where I really thought I needed to get people out. She didn't go to Wisconsin at all. So
After she got the nomination, that was the I did the numbers for the Rust Belt states, and I even included Ohio in this. You look at Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania. She trailed Barack Obama's total vote, just raw vote total, about 450,000 votes. That was some quick math on the back of the envelope. Trump improved upon Romney by 450,000 votes. She trailed Obama by 1.2 million votes. And so when you talk about this voter revolution in the Rust Belt, it was as much the dampened turnout on her side as it was a slightly increased turnout on his side. And so, that's, you take those electoral votes out, that's 10, 16, 18, and 20. You're talking the election right there.
Right, and he gets a lot of criticism for maybe not having the details in his platform, but over and over again you heard kind of simple talking points. I'm going to make you great. I'm going to deal with trade. I'm going to build the wall. I'm going to do all these things. She had a good platform of things like infrastructure, education, job creation, but they never really talked about it. Do you remember a coherent talking point from Hillary Clinton? I don't.
I don't even.
No, and that's been one of the biggest criticisms I've heard. I also wonder, we talk about polling and the importance of it, but I do wonder going forward, many of us don't answer our cell phones anymore when it's an unknown number. I wonder how accurate this data really is. You've been covering politics, I know, in Virginia for more than 20 years, but long term, I just wonder about the place of polling.
Well, and I guess I went back to 2012 with Mitt Romney, and I remembered all the places they said they thought he was possibly going to win. And I think Ohio was one of them. He didn't do that well, so it does make you, and then you'll talk to these political scientists and they'll say, well, that's a Republican poll, or that's a Democrat poll, leaning poll. It really shouldn't be that way. There is a margin for error for a reason. And I think that's, in really toward the end, she was very much within the margin. Her lead was 3 points or 4 points or 2 points. I mean, that's pretty close, actually. Yeah. And ultimately, when the popular vote is counted, she'll probably, I don't know, 1 million or so, maybe a couple of million. But that's why I think the Electoral College is important, because, if you're California, New York, you shouldn't dominate an election. It should be Iowa. It should be Kansas. It should be America. It shouldn't be 2 states. I mean, Virginia's become a lot, in many respects, I hate to say it, but Northern Virginia is, you have to go through Northern Virginia to win an election in Virginia.
Right, so you mentioned Virginia, and let's use that as a jumping off point a little bit to talk about the 2017 elections, coming up. Virginia has, a lot of people consider Virginia blue now. And, the last few election cycles, presidential election cycles in particular, have proven that to be the case. It's also been the case that a lot of times, when the Republican is president, that it's different in Virginia. So I'm just curious, with 2017 coming up, who do we see as front runners for running for that? And what are your predictions for that as far as whether a Republican or a Democrat will prevail?
Well, Ed Gillespie did pretty well when he ran against Mark Warner, actually did fairly well in Northern Virginia, and he's based in Northern Virginia, and I think Loudoun was one of the places he did pretty well, and that's an important county. He would seem, he has support of more than 50% of the General Assembly. I've talked to Republican legislators, they seem to think he's got a very good shot at the nomination. This guy, Corey Stewart, interesting guy, got fired from the Trump campaign, chairman of the Prince William County Board of Supervisors. But after I interviewed him, a story came out in the Post that the Trump people were really mad at him and upset at him. And I would think it's going to be tough for him. Frank Wagner and Rob Whitman. Frank Wagner's a big business guy, wanted to do the uranium mining in Pennsylvania. He tends to be kind of a big business kind of guy, Chamber of Commerce kind of guy. Rob Whitman, I'll be honest with you, I don't know an awful lot about him. He just won re-election to Congress. I would say Gillespie has a really good shot. He's probably raised the money. And
he ran so well, as you mentioned, against Mark Warner in 2014. And not only did he run well against him, and that was another instance where the polls came into question, because the polls there was maybe one poll at the very end that had that race close, but all the polls, other than that, seemed to have an 8 to 10 to 12 point race.
Right.
Turned out to be a razor-thin margin for Warner. And what was interesting about that was the exit polls had Warner's popularity ratings where they always are, 58 to 60%.
Right.
And yet, that said, Gillespie ran so well against him, so that makes him a formidable challenger.
Right, and you've heard Donald Trump talk about a lot of things, and I think Dodd-Frank is one of the things that he's against. Well, Ed Gillespie doesn't like Dodd-Frank. So they may be more in alignment on some of these issues and some of the things that Donald Trump wants to do, and maybe he would be happy to campaign or support Ed Gillespie. So, Ralph Northam is coming to the area here in a couple of weeks, and he seems like a thoroughly nice guy. And he's a doctor, a physician. He's well-liked by his Senate colleagues, but I don't know that the name recognition across the state, that's something he's going to have to work on, I think.
Well, Democrats maybe at least avoided what it seems Republicans had an issue with the past couple cycles, where when Bill Bolling was lieutenant governor, there was an issue with Ken Cuccinelli, who's going to run for the governor, even dating back to Bob McDonnell. When Republicans had both the attorney general and lieutenant governor seats, there seemed to be divisions created by that, who gets to be the number one guy. The Democrats at least solved that problem early when Mark Herring said, hey, I'll step aside, I'm letting Ralph Northam run. But traditionally, the Attorney General, Republican Attorney Generals, we've seen them run for governor quite a bit. There's more, it seems like more headlines maybe for an Attorney General than there is for a Lieutenant Governor.
Right.
In Virginia, the Lieutenant Governor is a part-time guy. So,
right.
So that could be, could play into that disadvantage you're talking about there.
Right. And if you've met Ralph Northam, I've only met him like one time. He seems like, again, a very decent fellow, but he's kind of low-key.
Yeah, he is. Yeah.
That may be something he has to develop more of a style of campaigning and becoming more comfortable with the retail side of getting elected. He could probably do that. But Gillespie obviously is a veteran. Not only has he run for office, he's managed campaigns and ran the Republican Party and state and nationally and worked for George Bush. I mean, he has all the experience you'd ever want for a candidate. So he knows the recipe, I think you would say.
So Virginia went for Clinton by 5 points, 200,000 votes or so. But could there be a national tailwind behind Gillespie or whoever gets that nomination?
There could be, and I think too, the early months of the Trump administration, if they have some victories early on, if things go well, that could bode well for Ed Gillespie. If they are able to do some of the things they really want to do, I think it's important for Donald Trump to get off to a good start. I really think that's important, not just for him. It's important for the Republicans and Congress, and there's a perception that Congress has just not been very well. They haven't accomplished a great deal the last few years. Now they'll say it's executive orders and gridlock and so forth, but I don't think they'll have that excuse anymore. It'll be a Republican Congress and a Republican president. They really ought to be able to get something done, some measures accomplished. If it's whatever it is, repeal of Obamacare or some of these other executive orders being, and I don't know, the immigration thing seems rather volatile to me. I mean, now I think he's dropped it down to 2 or 3 million who will be deported immediately or moved. I wonder about that.
Right. Shifting gears just a little bit, Tim Kaine had his chance in the national spotlight. Mark Warner's been mentioned as a name, perhaps, of someone who might be a vice presidential or presidential candidate. Chris and I have had our own discussions about whether or not, we see him on the national platform in 4 years or something like that. What do you feel about that?
Well, I'm sure he's still thinking about it, and he's really been on the right side of a lot of these issues, such as debt reduction and tax reform. And tax reform is a bipartisan issue, and I think he could work with the Republicans on that. He's been right about a lot of things, and it's unfortunate they never got his opportunity to run. I think he would make a terrific president. And I guess Kaine could possibly resurface as at least a player in the Democratic Party, but he didn't really get a lot of exposure in this election, and I guess that debate performance really was not a successful debate performance. He's a very substantive man, and I think he can go back in Congress and particularly on his niche of foreign policy and defense and so forth, and be a very successful sort of a latter-day John Warner, I think. I mean, that's possible for him to do that. He's got a chance to make a good real contribution, but I think Mark Warner's probably still thinking about it. And he knows he may try, he may make a pitch, but it's the raising of the money and the amount of time involved, and maybe that's discouraging to him.
I'll throw some thoughts in there too. I think a lot like Bob does. We've both had the opportunity to do sit-downs with them many times over the years, dating back to their time in Richmond, obviously. It seems to me that the Democratic Party's both parties are in a flux. I mean, with Donald Trump, he ran as much against the Republican Party as he did against the Democratic Party. He ran against the establishment of both parties. And so it'll be interesting to see the next 4 years, the next 6 months, how things shake out between the Freedom Caucus and the more moderate mainstream Republicans, and then the Trump Republicans who are starting to develop and coalesce. I think also, though, what I call the DLC Democrats, the Democratic Leadership Council, the more moderate, centrist, business-focused Democrats, they may have had their moment in the sun now. And Mark Warner is probably one of those guys. Tim Kaine's probably one of those guys, too. I think that the ascendancy is probably going to be more in the direction of people like Bernie Sanders, who himself will be probably too old to run in 4 years for president, but he'll be 79 years old in 2020. Maybe Elizabeth Warren. I mean, it seems like maybe the party's going to be moving away from the Mark Warners and Tim Kaines.
Well, that would certainly be an interesting race if it turned out to be Donald Trump running for re-election against Elizabeth Warren. They've already had a pretty active Twitter war.
They have,
so that would be, she's a very interesting woman and very bright and understands, I think, the economy and banking and consumer issues. So it would be, that would be quite a face-off if that happened. You know.
Well, this has been good. We've kind of made some sense of the 2016 elections. We got you ready, at least a starting point, ready for 2017. So it's been a good Viewpoints.
It has. So we appreciate you joining us, Bob. We appreciate you joining us as well. And we'll look forward to having you join us again next week.
That's right. Well, for Crystal Graham, I'm Chris Graham. Thank you for joining us on Viewpoints. Have a great week, everybody.